the deep strike campaign is a really useful complement to what's happening on the front line. And it more than mirrors what the Russians do. They strike at civilian targets inside Ukraine to kind of break Ukrainian morale, which hasn't happened yet. But they also hit the energy infrastructure to try and undermine their ability to survive the winter. Well, this really is focusing on military and military industrial targets, and I think that it's an important complement to what's happening on the front line. I mean, I'm sort of slightly ducking the question about, like, are we seeing it really biting into the Russian economy? That's harder to tell. It certainly seems to be having some impact, but I think the economic side of the campaign is a frankly much tougher target because of the relative resilience that is in the Russian system, even though there are definitely weaknesses emerging.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined once again by Matthew Savill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Matthew, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good afternoon.
We have a lot to discuss. We will, of course, come on to the significance of the first week of the second Trump presidency. But first of all, I wanted to get your reaction to some of the things we've seen on the ground, both in Ukraine and in Russia. And starting off with this Ukrainian drone attack on a Russian oil refinery over the weekend, the Ryazan oil refinery southeast of Moscow. There's some very dramatic footage, huge explosions. What does that tell us about the current state of Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy infrastructure?
I mean, I wouldn't want to sort of leap to a conclusion on the basis of that attack alone, but what it forms part of is a trend of the increasing volume of these kinds of attacks over several months now, which is showing that the Ukrainians really are able to increase the production, their domestic industrial capacity to produce these kind of drones, and continue to target and successfully implement some really long-range strikes using these. I mean, they're still to be different and developing kinds of drones. And that campaign, that deep strike campaign, is fulfilling a number of purposes. It is striking at Russian military infrastructure. It's the best way for them to get at the air bases from which some of the Russian long-range attacks are launched, because they're far beyond the range of things that we've talked about previously, like Storm Shadow cruise missiles. It's a way of trying to strike some of the bases where the glide bomb launching aircraft come from. It's a way of hitting ammunition supply and storage that are well back from the front line, although obviously some are closer. And it's this way of trying to eat into the Russian military-industrial complex and its revenue generation, so energy, production, oil, and that sort of thing. I mean, all of that is about bringing the war home to Russia, which is a kind of, if you like, an attack on Russian morale. But there is this, if you like, interdiction campaign, which is about really trying to eat into some of Russia's advantages.
And are we seeing an impact, particularly when you look at, both the sense of the war is coming home to Russia, and we know that there were also drone attacks on Moscow as well over the weekend, but also when it comes to the impact on Putin's economy, and we know how important his natural resources are to his economy. Are we starting to see an impact yet through this drone warfare?
I think to a degree. I mean, I'm wary of saying, as I have before, that there's no chance of this changing the course of the war, because I think the deep strike campaign is a really useful complement to what's happening on the front line. And it more than mirrors what the Russians do. They strike at civilian targets inside Ukraine to kind of break Ukrainian morale, which hasn't happened yet. But they also hit the energy infrastructure to try and undermine their ability to survive the winter. Well, this really is focusing on military and military industrial targets, and I think that it's an important complement to what's happening on the front line. I mean, I'm sort of slightly ducking the question about, like, are we seeing it really biting into the Russian economy? That's harder to tell. It certainly seems to be having some impact, but I think the economic side of the campaign is a frankly much tougher target because of the relative resilience that is in the Russian system, even though there are definitely weaknesses
Mm.
emerging.
And I think the phrase you used a moment ago, Matthew, was the new and innovative ways that Ukraine are using drone warfare. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we are actually seeing? What are some of those innovations? Because, of course, this is the largest drone war in history. And ever since the start of the conflict, we've seen innovations all the time.
Yep. I think what we would do is we would differentiate between what's happening on the front line and the role that drones are playing at all levels, and this campaign, which is, if you like, it's almost like a conventional deep strike campaign, but instead of using crewed aircraft that launch um, missiles, or go back as far as sort of large bomber raid kind of thing, it is compensating for the lack of currently a large Ukrainian Air Force based strike campaign, and the fact that they're still developing some of their ground launched weapons. They've talked relatively recently about ground launched ballistic missiles, but this deep strike campaign is effectively in lieu of that. And I mean, would be recognised to lots of people who've studied industrial warfare before. But what is different is the ability of Ukrainian defence industry to now begin to pump out these kind of weapons. I mean, I should say they would still want to and are still developing cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, because thus far, lots of these drones have their own drawbacks. For example, they don't have the kind of deep penetrating warheads that you might find on sophisticated cruise missiles. They don't necessarily have the payload you can put on a decent sized ballistic missile. And we still suspect that they have to launch a lot to get some through, because they get shot down or they don't reach their target for various reasons. But it is striking that they can still get them through Russian air defenses. And I think there's an interesting contrast there, in that the figures that are being released by the Ukrainians at the moment are that the Shahed type drone, and now the Russian copies of those drones, the majority of them are either shot down or effectively disrupted with electronic warfare. So the Russians aren't having the same success rate.
Mm.
If you assume the aim there is to just destroy things, I think the point on the Russian use of those kind of large drones in large numbers is that in many respects they are about depleting or stressing Ukrainian air defenses, because that's where the Russians do have a relatively large and increasing stockpile of air-launched cruise missiles and ballistic missiles.
And the fact that some of these Ukrainian drones, or so many it appears, are getting through Russian air defences, is that because Russian air defences can't keep up, that there aren't enough of them, or just if you send enough drones, some will inevitably get through?
I mean, it's a combination of all of the above, because the area that the Russians have to defend is vast. I mean, we are talking hundreds of thousands, probably millions of square kilometers. And it's not as straightforward as effectively defending the border. And as long as you can throw up a screen there, then you're fine. You've got to defend, along the route. You've got to put up point defenses. You've got different routes that the incoming drones can take. Where are your sensors effective? How many of your air defenses have you actually moved around to, say, Crimea, where we've seen the destruction of radar sites and some of those ground-based air defenses? How much have the Russians got to put to, if you like, the east of Ukraine, where we've seen drone strikes onto other bases? So the area that's being defended is enormous, and that's before you get down to the question of how good are Russian air defenses and how good is their sensors, where are their gaps in their radar coverage. Lots of these drones, there's a trade-off in that they might be slow, they might take several hours to reach their target, but they have varying degrees of they're not stealth, but if you they're difficult, or some of them can be difficult to spot on radar, especially if they fly at low altitude.
But I'm guessing if you are the Kremlin, you are nonetheless deeply concerned by the failures in your own air defences.
I mean, I think they would be worried, or at least they should be worried about the extent to which some of their locations seem vulnerable, and we've seen over the past 2.5 years the extent to which occasionally the Russians have had to move forces around. So their long-range bomber forces have moved air bases several times. There have been some occasions where the Ukrainians have followed up these long-range drone strikes with what looks like sabotage efforts, where they've managed to penetrate small teams into Russia, launch smaller drones, or, if you like, have distracted them by attacking ground targets like railways. And so the Russians are looking for an air threat, and then all of a sudden a sabotage team have blown up rail links bringing supplies into the area. So what they don't have is absolute security around their rear areas. They do have a lot, in terms of volume, and they have spread it out a lot. So it's still not an easy target for the Ukrainians, but it is impressive that they are upping the ante on this side of things, which they probably calculate they have to do. They've got to start inflicting more and more damage deep into Russia on these kind of targets, because I think the overall picture is that Russia is expending enormous resources on this war, but it's got just enough depth in its military industrial complex, in its energy production facilities, to keep going at least for this year.
Well, that brings us on. The point about its energy resources brings us on to Donald Trump, who, of course, was sworn in this time last week for his second term as US president. And one of the biggest questions of 2025 is how he will approach the war between Russia and Ukraine. I thought, first of all, before we get on to his specific comments about Ukraine and Russia, are you among those, Matthew, who thinks that Trump's pledge to ramp up domestic US oil production in the long term could do serious damage to Vladimir Putin's economy?
I mean, this is where I sort of stray slightly outside my field of expertise in terms of that genuine economic side of warfare, as you might call it, macroeconomics, how that could affect the balance of the conflict. I think the people who understand how this works have highlighted a number of pressures in the Russian economy, and they are hugely dependent on energy for revenue, but they have reduced their dependence over the past few years after the initial impact of sanctions has also been factored in. And by that I mean the internal Russian economy has helped soften the blow that has been created by sanctions. There's also a degree of sanctions evasion going on, but there's been more internal employment. So Russian unemployment has dropped as they've attempted to sort of create more revenue from internal Russian financial activity, economic activity. And so my understanding is that actually the revenue from energy export has dropped as a percentage, because the rest of the economy has done some compensation. And that's how the Russian economy was able to continue growing after that initial round of sanctions and further sanctions were levied. Of course, what many experts will point out is that many of the sanctions have basically been evaded, and so their impact has been diminished, but that means there's scope to do more. I think overall the Russian economy looks pretty creaky, but the question is it resilient enough to last for the duration that Putin needs it to achieve some of the military objectives that he's after?
Well, and on that note, I mean, it was interesting Donald Trump coming out last week and saying if Putin does not end the war, he will impose new taxes, new tariffs, and new sanctions on Russia. Now, what exactly those sanctions might be, because sanctions have been imposed already, but whether you could go after the shadow fleet in a more effective way, who knows? What do you make of those comments? I mean, it maybe is a bolder stance against Russia than we have been used to from Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think it's no surprise that Trump did, in fact, not end the war in his first 24 hours. And I think everyone understood that was always hyperbole. I also think there are some concerns in the approach that he might take. But at the same time, it's not been as bad as it could have been. And I think that's in part because the Ukrainians did everything that they could to try and pitch themselves as the reasonable party in any forthcoming negotiations. So they said they were ready to talk. They've tried to remain active on the battlefield. They've done an awful lot of positive messaging at the US and at Trump as a, if you like, winner. And that means they've tried to put the onus on Putin as being as the one who will be unreasonable. So I think they've given themselves a reasonable chance of influencing Trump's position, and him coming out with that strong statement, putting a lot of the responsibility on Putin and the Russians to negotiate, would be exactly the sort of thing they're looking for. I think there are two caveats on it, though. The first is that it's not clear how much additional sanctions would actually, or tariffs would actually matter. That requires there to be direct trade with the US, not a huge amount, and also lots of people who are currently trading with Russia who would suddenly stop. And I think, the things that, if you say the Chinese, the Iranians, other people do to trade in, or evade sanctions, suggests that they're not going to be inclined to change their minds for now. But it does mean that there might be scope for a more muscular enforcement of those sanctions, going after the shadow fleet. So things that are already in place, making sure they're actually done. The other caveat is that the battlefield situation where the front line is and the balance at the moment isn't particularly favorable towards the Ukrainians. We can talk a bit about some of the military challenges they're facing. But what that means is time is not on their side, and they need quite a lot of it to redress that balance. Otherwise, the negotiations will just result in a pretty dismal outcome for them, which is them having to settle for having a reasonable chunk of their country out of their control and not much prospect of turning the tide, or rather getting it back. And that's where things slightly favour Putin if he thinks he can eke out military activity for the rest of 2025, because what he could do is play for time or enter into negotiations but do so essentially disingenuously and move slowly, grinding his way forward until such a time as then there is a pause called, whereupon it will suit him. That will have been done at enormous cost. By no means would that be victory for Russia, but it would have inflicted enough damage on Ukraine and put them in an unfavorable position from which to try and, they're going to have to think years forward about how might they regain their territory, how might they outflank the Russians. So there's an awful lot of that could still happen to influence the very long term. And I think a lot of people are sceptical that any cessation of violence this year would be a permanent cessation. But the challenge is that getting the Ukrainians into a good position this year is going to require patience and discipline. And neither of those are things that Donald Trump has shown that he has in abundance.
There was a piece over the weekend in the Times by our special correspondent, Anthony Lloyd, going through sort of 4 scenarios of how this war could end. I'll just put them to you briefly, Matthew, and get your take on them. Number 1, it was the idea that Ukraine is just completely militarily defeated. If Trump, for example, decides, you know what, no more military aid, I'm pulling the rug from underneath your feet. Number 2 is some kind of bad deal for Ukraine, whereby they're forced to sue for peace from a position of weakness, and essentially a kind of a quisling government is installed in Kyiv. Number 3, a ceasefire, but of course that's how long does that last, and does that lead to something more permanent? And number 4, a negotiated settlement, which of the 4 options appears most favourable to Ukraine, but it depends on what the terms are, and it probably involves some territorial concessions in exchange for security guarantees. Of those options, Matthew, what at the moment appears the most feasible?
I think at the moment what we're looking at is some kind of negotiated settlement, but not on particularly favourable terms. There's a bit of a blurring of the lines between that and a ceasefire, because what you might find is something that's not a permanent, neither a ceasefire nor what the
Mm.
Ukrainians would want for a negotiated settlement would be final, I think, at the moment. I don't see the Ukrainians being defeated in the way that you're describing in terms of a complete collapse at the moment, not least because the Russians don't quite have the ability to have these sort of massive breakthroughs that would suddenly result in the unraveling of the whole Ukrainian position. But they can certainly force the Ukrainians back in ways that are unpleasant for them in terms of losing much more territory, particularly in the Donbass. Um, I do think there's still scope, for example, of the trading in of the territory that they're holding inside Kursk, but that's value has diminished as they've
And
taken
what would you
losses.
get in exchange for that, do you think?
Well, good question. I mean, the most obvious answer is you would effectively trade it for the bit of for the conflict that's happening next to it, which is the Kharkiv lodgement. You know, the Russians haven't done particularly well there, but they are just over the border threatening Kharkiv. You could maybe see a direct swap for it. I'm not sure if that's what the Ukrainians would want to do, but they're holding about 45% of what they held in August last year, and
Mm.
they've lost a lot of people and equipment to get that lodgement. So I think that the problem is that it's still worth something, but probably not what they were hoping 6 months ago, 5 months ago, I would say. So I think the real issue is, where does the front line end up? And what does that look like in terms of future ambitions? As I say, that there is a problem that for the Russians it wouldn't be job done. And indeed, depending on what a post ceasefire settlement looks like, you might see Western forces entering Ukraine in some kind of tripwire force, although they need to take risk to do that. And of course, the whole aim of Putin going into Ukraine in the first place was to reduce
Mm.
Western influence. It was to put it firmly back into Russia's sphere of influence. I mean, the fact, here I am sort of slightly meandering through these different explanations. The fact that the outcomes are so messy at the moment and so costly for both sides are a kind of indicator of the risk of there simply being a pause and a return to fighting in several years, because no one's going to be wholly satisfied with it. Even if the Russians do get to hold a reasonable chunk, 18 to 20% of Ukraine, that's not a great trade for what might be, by the end of this year, 1 million casualties.
And if there were Western troops in Ukraine enforcing some kind of demilitarized zone or under some kind of security arrangement, who knows? Would that include US troops?
I think the first thing is that we don't really know what's on the table here, because a lot of this discussion is sort of being filtered through speculation. I find it hard to believe that you would have a classic peacekeeping force, because peacekeeping forces of the kind that are supported by the UN are fundamentally neutral forces. Well, we're very much not neutral in this conflict. Then you've got a question of, like, are they there to train? Are they there as a kind of presence that would be a tripwire that would pull in other allies? I think it's difficult to see a US commitment at the moment, given the way that Trump continues to talk about the use of forces. And that's the bit of what he said in the past week that is difficult for the Ukrainians, which is that he looks very much not committed to further conflict.
Mm.
I mean, obviously, for some people, that's really good news that the US is talking in less interventionist terms, but it means the Europeans are going to have to stump up for European security, and not before time, many would say.
Well, indeed, and I thought it was really fascinating that we had President Zelensky at the World Economic Forum in Davos last week, and he kind of chided European leaders over their failure to commit more to the continent's defence, but also Ukraine's defence. I think at one point he said, and it's interesting because this is almost a message I thought that was aimed as much at Donald Trump as it was at Europe, but he said, will President Trump even notice Europe's contribution? And I thought that was really interesting, that he's obviously trying to drive home that message to who should be Ukraine's most natural allies, that frankly they need to do more.
By value, European military support is not actually that far off US military support. But the point is that's the cumulative effort of a couple of dozen countries. And it's still the case that the biggest single donor by far is the US, and also they provide lots of the sophisticated weapons. And indeed, some of what Europe is supplying, it's bought from the US. And so we still have this question about European industrial capacity, European investment in its own defence industry. There should be a virtuous circle in terms of the relationship between supporting Ukraine, more investment in European defence industry, and deterring Russia. But of course, that requires somebody to put the investment in the first place.
And of course, the Times has been reporting today that the UK government is reluctant to make a commitment to meet 2.5% of GDP on defence spending earlier than currently forecast, which is 2030. Do you think that is short-sighted on their part?
I mean, what I think it is that it's a sign that either defence is simply not a real priority, or that the financial situation is incredibly dire, because we're spending 2.3% at the moment. So you're talking about a 0.2 increase. It's not nothing. It's tens of billions over 5 years, but that's in the scale of an economy that is much larger than that, and at a time of war in Europe. So I think the fact that they're not prepared to even say, oh, we could do that within the scope of the next parliament, says that either we've got even bigger financial problems than we thought, or they're just a bit unconvinced by the need for that extra investment. And I think that's problematic, because what is required is fairly heavy investment to rebuild our conventional forces. Now, I would say in either case, the 3 billion worth of funding that goes into supporting Ukraine each year sounds like it is guaranteed. But of course, that includes spending on operations in Eastern Europe, as well as actually buying stuff that goes to Ukraine. So we've always got to remember how that 3 billion is being spent.
Matthew, we always appreciate your insight and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.